Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. So far, the weekend of the 2017 Chinese Grand Prix has been an absolute debacle, with effectively no running happening in Free Practice 1, and Free Practice 2 being cancelled outright. The predominant reasons for this are the weather conditions in and around Shanghai. They are such that visibility has been rendered to essentially zero, and that means that the medical helicopter, which of course is absolutely essential to have operating for any on-track action to take place, can't fly. And if the medical helicopter can't fly, that means that in the event that anything serious should happen to anybody and they need to be evacuated to an area hospital, that can't happen. And of course, that's a dangerous situation, and we don't want that occurring. We don't want to have a situation where either a driver, a crew member, or in the worst case scenario and something horrible happens at the race, that spectators need to be evacuated and they can't be evacuated, obviously. That's a safety concern that we have to be worried about, and we have to respect those parameters to say if the helicopter can't fly, we can't have any on-track action. That is 100% understandable, and the only intelligent decision to make in that situation is to cancel the event, cancel the running for a given session. That makes sense. What the disarray of this weekend so far has gotten me thinking about, though, is not so much the climatic conditions in this part of the world and why we go to this part of the world at the times we do. We do know that Eastern Asia tends to be a somewhat wet environment, and that only gets worse the farther on in the year that we get. The rainy season in Eastern Europe tends to go on from about summertime in the Northern Hemisphere, so June, all the way to the end of the year, and we see this quite often at the Japanese Grand Prix, which tends to be around September and October. Usually rain plays a part in that weekend in one of the sessions, if not it's being an entire washout in general. In some more recent years, the Japanese Grand Prix has been interfered with by typhoons, in other words, hurricanes, and that is a very interesting scenario that we've actually seen play out a couple of times in the recent history of the Japanese Grand Prix. But more so than that, though, this whole situation has gotten me thinking about the relative amounts of inflexibility Formula One seems to have, not necessarily with the formatting of the races, but in terms of having alternate venues perhaps ready to go in the event that something like this happens. Now, hear me out. Formula One is probably the quintessential case study in logistical management. You have between 18 and 20 races happening in the last decade or so, every single year, all around the world. And I can't think of another major operation that moves that many personnel, that much technical infrastructure, and that much hard infrastructure around the world 20 times a year with the speed, efficiency, and reliability that Formula One does. So if you're going to be studying logistics for any reason, Formula One is the quintessential example to look at, because the way in which they're able to get this entire circus around the world every year is absolutely ridiculous, and it works a treat every time. We hardly ever hear reports of teams being held up in terms of transporting their personnel or equipment, anything like that. Everything is just like clockwork. However, when you get to a race, and then you have significant disruptions to the race weekend, we've seen this a few times in the recent past, but it doesn't happen that often, quite thankfully I must say. But when it does happen, an interesting thing happens. You have 3 days over the race weekend, the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Friday we practice, Saturday morning we practice, and then Saturday afternoon we qualify, and then of course we race on Sunday afternoon. That doesn't leave any time really for any sorts of adjustments to happen on the fly if need be. And what this means is that if you have a disruption in a session or you have to cancel a session, the teams miss out on a whole lot of running, and that's not good. This year we have essentially new cars in terms of their behavior out on track. We've got a lot more aerodynamics, we have a lot more mechanical grip, the cars are 5 seconds a lap faster, or so we've been told. We've yet to see this really happen in a race session, but it's gonna happen, trust me. We've seen it in testing, it's gonna be there. That 5 seconds a lap is gonna be there. Now, although the cars are effectively unchanged from a mechanical standpoint, from what they were in the last couple of seasons with the hybrid power units and all of this stuff, we still don't have a whole lot of data in terms of how these things actually behave in race situations or in wet weather and that sort of situation. So as we go into the Chinese Grand Prix, and there's a very high likelihood that the race is going to be wet, if the teams haven't had a lot of running to figure out how these cars are going to behave, is it wise then to send these drivers out in a race with cars that they effectively haven't driven in conditions that they certainly have not seen? Yes, there were a couple days at Catalunya in winter testing where the track was artificially wet. However, this weekend so far, we've heard from Kimi Räikkönen. He was asked about how the Ferrari was handling during those wet test sessions at Catalunya, and he said that when you wet the track artificially, it really does not resemble actual rainfall so much, because the dry line forms almost instantly and then it's effectively dry again. So this is effectively an unknown in terms of how the cars are going to behave in the rain. FP1 was a greatly abbreviated session, mostly because for most of the session the medical helicopter couldn't fly, so not even every driver got out on track, and only a handful of laps were turned for those who did. FP2 was cancelled outright, so no running for anybody. That leaves us with the situation of, for Saturday morning, we have free practice 3, and then that's followed a couple hours later by qualifying. Free practice 3 is a 60-minute session, so that means that the teams, over the course of this entire weekend, have only 1 hour to get their drivers up to speed. For example, Lance Stroll, I don't think he's ever driven this track before. He has 1 hour now to learn it in a car with which he's still somewhat unfamiliar. And everybody else has to learn how their cars are going to behave on this circuit, which is the first traditional circuit we are visiting this year, with a lot of high-speed corners. And as I said, with these cars being at least 5 seconds a lap faster with all that downforce, those corners are going to be approached in a very different manner this year than they have been in some recent years past. That leaves us with the problem of you have very limited time to learn how to deal with what is effectively a completely new package from an aerodynamic standpoint, with very little data to go on. If you're a rookie like Lance Stroll, I'm not entirely sure if you have the capacity to deal with something like that, simply because you're a rookie. And even though you're very talented and you have raced and won in lower categories, this is Formula One, and these are the fastest race cars we have ever seen. So it leads me to question the wisdom of putting these guys into a race situation with that much limited running going into it. It just seems like it's a little bit harried, a little bit rushed, and perhaps it's not the most intelligent decision. However, going back into the formatting of the race weekend, what else are we to do at this point? We lost almost all of our running on Friday, so that leaves Saturday morning to figure everything out, simply because there's no other time left. When you cancel both practice sessions, you're taking 3 hours away from the teams. With FP3 being 60 minutes long, that is not enough time. You cannot do in 1 hour what you would normally do in 3. And if you can get through your entire program, you're not going to have done as thorough a job as you would have liked, and that opens up the possibility of having things overlooked. When you're going as fast as these cars go, you want to make sure everything is as it should be and everything is as you think it is. So substituting 1 hour running for 3 hours of running, that doesn't seem like a good decision to me. On to the point of, can we be more flexible with our race weekends, though? With the current race weekend format, there is effectively nothing we can do. You've only got 3 days, and only one of those days is entirely devoted to practice. In this era, it's effectively testing. With the testing ban that's been in place for a long time now, these practice sessions are the team's only opportunity to get some real data from the car out on track, hear from the drivers what's the car actually doing, rather than running all of our computer simulations and having the drivers run in the simulators. It just doesn't work from my vantage point to say, okay, you have no Friday running, so you have to do everything in 60 minutes on Saturday and then get it perfect to go qualifying a couple hours later. That doesn't work, fundamentally. It just doesn't pass a basic logic test. The reason why I'm worried about this, though, is mostly on the grounds of safety. When things get shaken up in Formula One, we see a trend of danger. And this is going back really to Imola 1994. 1994 was a big year of technical shakeup. They banned traction control, they banned ABS, they banned active suspension, and Imola being round 3 of that championship, the teams are still relatively unfamiliar with their equipment, the drivers are still learning about how to get everything up to speed, and Senna in particular was still very much trying to grapple with the changes that Williams had to make to their car, and Williams of course being on the back foot because they were the dominators of that active suspension era. So 1994 we got to Imola. It was the first real high-speed circuit on the calendar, especially with Tamburello Corner. It was the first time that most of those cars had gone through that corner, full throttle, flat-out, long left-hander as it was back then, without the chicanes that were added later, and Senna has an accident. Is that because Williams didn't get their ride height correct or whatever? We can speculate forever, and many people have, but the point is, the teams were in a novel situation for the first time, with no data to back up how the cars were going to behave, and then something bad happened. We can further substantiate this worry with the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix. 2014, the first year for those hybrid power units. DRS had been introduced a couple of years prior, but it was still finicky in terms of how we were dealing with the regulations. Initially, DRS was completely free. You could use it whenever you wanted, except for in the races, and then they reined in DRS a little bit more. There was still some worry in 2014 about KERS and the hybrid power units in terms of how much of an advantage does one team have over another, and how can the drivers use it, and things like that. Plus, you had the gimmicks of double points and all of that political pressure going into it, so there was more pressure on the drivers in 2014 as well as in 1994. And in both years, something very bad happened that resulted in the loss of a driver. What we see now is a similar situation. 2017, the cars are faster than they have ever been before, at least by some simulations that I've run and other people have run. So it is a complete unknown from that side. And now you're going into a race weekend, 2017 China, where you also have an unknown in terms of you don't have any time running, and we're going to release these guys into a race. That scares me. That scares me quite a bit, and I'm not entirely sure what can be done at this point. There was some chatter a few hours ago about perhaps moving the race up to Saturday afternoon because the weather conditions for Sunday are not projected to be good. They may be bad enough again so that the medical helicopter cannot fly. In that case, then the race is not going to happen. But that would put even more pressure on the organizers and on Formula One in general, because everybody has to leave China and then proceed directly to Bahrain. And there's no way that you're going to be able to get the race in on China on Monday, because everybody's got to leave immediately after that checkered flag falls in China and go to Bahrain. There's basically no turnaround time available. So you can't reschedule the race for Monday. There's just not enough time to do it. So you either push the race up further for Saturday afternoon, which will really leave these guys without any chance of running beforehand, or you try to do it on Sunday, and if the medical helicopter can't fly, then you get into a situation of you've lost a Grand Prix. And that isn't good at all, because the teams have all signed an agreement with Formula One management. We are going to do this number of races this year. There's this number of points on offer, and at the end of this, we will have a world champion crowned for both drivers and constructors. If you lose a round, that then effectively changes the terms of the championship, and that could start a whole political firestorm. We've seen a situation like this before in Formula One, namely the 2005 United States Grand Prix at Indianapolis, where, remember, in those days we still had a tire war, Michelin and Bridgestone. The Michelin company put out a release to all of their teams saying, you will not use our tires on the Turn 13 banking at Indianapolis. And all the Michelin teams had no choice but to abide by that directive, so we saw a 6-car race. There was chatter before that race started as to whether or not a chicane could be inserted into the circuit at turn 13 to slow the cars down across the banking. That would have solved the problem with the Michelin runners, because they were having issues with their tire integrity from a structural standpoint, being able to deal with that lateral loading on the turn 13 banking, which is turn 1 of the oval track at Indianapolis. But Everybody said no to that, we can't do it, so we ended up with a 6-car race. What seems to be happening in 2017, all of these years later, there was chatter about moving the race up to Saturday, and the FIA immediately says no. Without any investigation into it, the FIA just comes out and blanketly says, no, we're not going to do this, we're not going to investigate any alternatives to holding this Grand Prix at any time other than Sunday afternoon as scheduled. I understand you want to adhere to the race weekend format, and of course you want to adhere to the championship format, but if you have a situation where you are going to force the teams into trying to run on Sunday, with very little running beforehand, in bad weather, what is the outcome of that? Hopefully nothing. However, let's say the weather conditions on Sunday are good enough for the medical helicopter to fly, but not good enough for Formula One cars to run. Without much running, with no real wet weather testing beforehand, the drivers are now going to get side by side on the grid, 20 cars right next to each other, into turn 1, which is a very dangerous place, in extreme wet weather conditions with effectively no running beforehand. And what is the result of that? I don't know. But what we've seen time and time again, when we get into these harried and rushed situations in Formula One, something bad tends to happen. And it's worrying me a lot that we have not learned from what has happened in the past, namely Senna and Ratzenberger at Imola 94 and Jules Bianchi in Japan 2014. Similar situations where there's a lot of pressure on a lot of people to deliver a product, and we didn't have enough time really to assess what was needed in order for that product to be effective and safe. We have that identical situation happening again here in China, and it just makes me very worried about what we might be seeing. At this point, the wiser decision would be maybe to cancel the race because, well, if it's not going to be safe and these guys don't have running in these conditions in these cars, how could you expect them to do this? It becomes a lottery. And you hope that everything just turns out fine in that case, which maybe it will and maybe it won't. We don't know because we haven't had enough running. That's my main point here. You can't just go into these things completely unknown. The cars are enough of an unknown as they are. But with these conditions and with the limited running, you have absolutely no idea of how things are going to work. And if you're having troubles with the medical helicopter already, say you start the race on Sunday, and then the conditions deteriorate to the point where the helicopter can't fly, but before you throw the red flag, something happens, somebody needs to be evacuated, and now they can't be evacuated. There are just too many permutations that could arise here, and it's just a little bit bizarre and a little bit frightening. And what's equally frightening is the resistance of the FIA to say that we're not going to change this weekend format. We're not going to entertain either moving the race up or trying to reschedule the race for Monday morning or Monday afternoon because, well, we're on a timetable and we can't adjust that timetable. With all the logistical concerns that I've mentioned, it makes sense, but at the same time, we're dealing with the safety of the drivers, the marshals, the teams, and the spectators, and something's got to be done. And moreover, in terms of policy, something has to be done with how these race weekends are managed when a situation like this occurs. I think we need to build some time into the weekend in order for situations like this to play out if they arise. And this is not the first time we've seen a disrupted weekend, and it certainly won't be the last. But does this then mean, there's been a lot of talk about maybe changing the weekend format or the race format, most of which I think is absolutely ridiculous. They want to make the races shorter in some cases, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. We already saw Australia, in terms of time, was a very short race, which is to be expected with the cars being as much faster this year as they are. But there's talk about either reverse grids or having two races, one on the Saturday, one on the Sunday, and awarding half points in each. I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think that those are the answers. However, pushing the teams and drivers into a situation like we have this weekend certainly is not the answer either, because you've got limited running, there are big-time safety concerns, and you're just forcing everybody into an uncomfortable position where you're trying to appease the political and commercial needs of the sport, as well as the very real safety needs for the teams, drivers, and spectators, and you can't reconcile these two in the situation that we have going on right now. So basically, there's nothing to report in terms of what's actually going to happen if there are going to be some addendums made to this race weekend. The race is still scheduled to happen on Sunday afternoon. Qualifying and FP3 are scheduled to happen in just a few hours, Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon time in Shanghai. We'll see if those actually happen. The weather conditions are not forecasted to be great. However, maybe we'll get lucky and all of this concern is for naught, but I'm not optimistic at this point. But in terms of the policy of running these race weekends, there needs to be something done to give us a little bit more contingency room, if you will, to be able to make adjustments and to make sure that these guys get the running that they need, especially this year in these cars that are brand new and nobody has any real data to apply to how they're going to perform at a circuit like Shanghai. They don't test here, they only run computer simulations here, but last year's data is not really applicable because these cars are just so much faster, the tires are different, nobody really knows. The teams that are well established, maybe they could look at 2004 to see what the cornering speeds are going to be, but fundamentally different engines, tires, and aerodynamics, that's not going to really be much of a help. So we will wait and see what happens in Shanghai, but that is what I am thinking about this right now, and let me know what you think about it. We will have more as this situation unfolds. Until next time, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very, very much for watching, and we will see you soon.